are listening to Lighthearted, the official podcast of the United States Lighthouse Society. My name is Jeremy D'Entremont. Welcome. This is another edition of Hearted Lite, a look back at interviews from the last 6.5 years of Lighthearted. Today we'll hear an edited version of a conversation that was first recorded at Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse in Florida back in May 2019 during a trip I did on the east coast of Florida. It was first heard in episode 16 of Lighthearted. The guest is Josh Liller, historian and collections manager for the Loxahatchee River Historical Society and Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse and Museum. Josh is also historian for the Florida Lighthouse Association. He's no stranger to listeners of this podcast. He's been on several times. Readers of the U.S. Lighthouse Society's journal, The Keeper's Log, should also be familiar with Josh's name from the articles he's written. A Florida resident from a young age, Josh's lifelong interest in history led to a history degree from Florida Atlantic University. He specializes in lighthouse and military history, and he's one of the most dedicated researchers into lighthouse history in the country today. He has not only done in-depth research into the history of Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse, but also into lighthouses, keepers, and builders from all over the U.S. He's also a tour guide, lecturer, and author. He's the co-author of 5,000 Years on the Loxahatchee and editor of the second edition of the Florida Lighthouse Trail. Let's listen to my conversation with Josh Liller now. What do you personally find especially compelling about lighthouse history in general, Josh?
The thing that's fascinated me the most about lighthouse history that I only learned as I started here is how little we know about them. Compared to a lot of other fields, it's a very understudied part of our history. My first big interest in history was mostly the Civil War. And at first I wanted to get into the Civil War field, battlefield guide or something like that. And I was just kind of amazed comparing the two, how much has been written about the Civil War and how much we know about the Civil War. And there are occasionally still very new topics you can mine, little aspects of it. But there's been a lot written, a lot of ink spilled about people like Grant and Lee and Lincoln. With lighthouses, there's so little research done on a lot of it because so much of the effort and the fundraising has been to simply preserve them and restore them and slowly build up visitation and bring people to them, that what happened there oftentimes falls to the wayside a little bit. And even what has been done a lot of times, you pick up some very casual lighthouse books and they're working off newspaper reports and sort of casual hearsay and the oral history of it, which oftentimes is built into some myth and misunderstanding over the years. And it's not until you really start cracking into National Archives and other first primary sources that you really start to find out what really happened and more details about it.
And specifically, what is it about the history of Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse here that makes it unique and interesting for you?
For me, like I mentioned, the interest in the Civil War, it was great to start out somewhere that George Meade had been our designer and who'd selected the site for our lighthouse. So it was a great little bonus connection to us. We're the oldest building in Palm Beach County. We might be the oldest surviving building between about Miami and Cape Canaveral, I think. Not to say that this area didn't have history. That's one of our things we try to educate visitors on, is that there is history before Disney and air conditioning. But in terms of surviving structures, our lighthouse is about the oldest thing around. We had all 5 branches of the U.S. military here at different times. We have a large lighthouse reservation, and so were able to make use of the extra space on the property, and that gives us sort of an extra bonus, like the building that we're in now, that's our meeting room and our gift shop and our museum, is an authentic military building that served in World War II.
I saw that you give a lot of interesting tours and presentations in the area, aside from what you do here at the Lighthouse. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about some of the subjects and personalities they might hear about in some of your lectures and tours?
So we're a little unusual for a lighthouse, that the lighthouse is really only part of our mission. We are the Loxahatchee River Historical Society, which means we're the local history organization for the whole Jupiter area. And the lighthouse is our centerpiece. That's what really draws people in, but it's a way to introduce them to more local history. So I do some talks here, I do them in local libraries, I get civic groups that make requests, and some of them are very simple and general, just want to know more about the history of the lighthouse. We have a lot of newcomers to the area. But some of the topics that I get to beyond that, we had we called a history trolley tour this year. New thing we're trying out. I'll definitely be doing it again in the future. And we just get a rented trolley bus and go drive around town and point out this building used to be here. This property used to be this. It gives people more of a sense of not just hearing about this history happened, but specifically how the town has changed over time. Another very popular one, in fact, I had 200 people at 2 different lectures on back-to-back days early this year. We had a guy named Trapper Nelson. He lived up the Loxahatchee River from the 1930s to the 1960s, and he was our local living legend. He was a trapper and a hunter and sold animals and animal skins, but he had a great camp up the river in remote wilderness. And it became a popular attraction, not just for locals who wanted to go boating for the day and have a picnic spot, but people would come from Jupiter Island and Palm Beach Island. And he had a real rugged Tarzan look to him that really drew the ladies in. And then he later became reclusive late in his life and died under circumstances some consider mysterious to this day. So it's a real fascinating figure that people really love to turn out to hear. My favorite topic, though, I think, I talk about our keepers. I have a lecture I talk about our keepers that we had a lot more than most people realize. We had almost 200 between the Civilian Lighthouse Service and the Coast Guard. But one of them in particular was a guy named Melville Spencer. And he had a camera and took photos on glass plate negatives back in the 1880s. And they're probably the oldest existing photos of the Jupiter area, Palm Beach County, and then later when he was down at the Sombrero Key Lighthouse in the Florida Keys. I've put together a presentation showing off these photos, which he sold a lot of them as stereo views to early tourists and things. And we keep finding more and more of them. So it's this growing body of work, it's beautiful photography just in general, but a connection of our lighthouse to local history and something we want to put together as a coffee table book to just show off all these amazing scenes in history done by a lighthouse keeper that we can thank him for.
Yeah, wow, what a treasure that is, and how unusual that is to have a keeper of that era taking so many pictures.
Right.
That's amazing. Now, if you were talking to somebody who was visiting the Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse and Museum for the first time, what would be your recommendation for things they should especially look for, things they should notice? What would you point out for them?
Well, the first thing about the lighthouse itself, we are one of 13 lighthouses in the entire United States that has an active first-order Fresnel lens in it. It's still active, has been there since the 1860s. Mm-hmm. We're very proud of that fact, and the Coast Guard's been very happy with how well we care for the lighthouse and the lens. Another very popular draw is down at the base of the hill that the lighthouse sits on. There's a massive ficus tree that really wows people probably more than anything except the lighthouse itself. And one thing that makes us also very unique, besides the local historical society aspect that I mentioned, our lighthouse reservation has been preserved. And it's a large lighthouse reservation. We're 120 acres. And our historical society 11 years ago successfully led a campaign to have congressional legislation that preserves it as an outstanding natural area. There's only 2 other designated ONAs, both over on the Pacific coast. And so 5 to 10 acres of our what we call the historic corridor, it's the prime area of the site with the military stations and the lighthouse and a Native American site. But the rest of the property has mostly been kept or restored to a natural area condition. You can go out there to nature trails and see wildlife and a mix of temperate and tropical plants. And we're surrounded by a developed area. Probably 70,000 people live in the Jupiter Quest area. So there's this little island of preserved wilderness here.
What's the most fun part of your job?
The most fun is the constant discovery and rediscovery. New things come in, some things that we're looking for, some things we had no idea that we'd want to look for that come in and we just go, wow, this is an exciting little aspect of our history that's great to know. Sometimes that we kind of learn, we go, oh, something we thought was a certain way. We've learned better now, whether it be research or people donate photos or things like that. Sometimes it's just new information, and we can look at something we've had and suddenly, now we see significance of this that we didn't have before. To tie it back into just mentioning Spencer's photography, someone recently was looking around the internet and they found the Getty Museum has a huge stereo view collection, and in it are 3 Spencer stereo views, 2 of which are relatively mundane photos of plants that we'd seen before. But one of them is a group of surveyors posed for a photo in front of the lighthouse with all their equipment. And because of the caption that was on the stereo view, we were able to then link it to newspaper research I've done to find out it was surveyors working for a guy named Hamilton Diston in 1882 that were surveying on ways to drain the Everglades. So we have a larger Florida historical issue there tying into our lighthouse with a great period photo. And another example, just recently we were contacted by possibly the last surviving veteran who served at our naval radio station. He's a 97-year-old World War II veteran, still sharp of mind, was able to tell us things about the naval radio station we didn't know before, give us photos we'd never seen before. And it's little things like that that just bring a certain amount of almost daily excitement to the job.
Yeah. Oh, it's all like finding treasure. And it's even for one lighthouse, it's like you're putting together a giant puzzle, and you never know where you're going to find the next piece.
It's a jigsaw puzzle where you don't even know how many pieces you have.
Right. And you're never done putting it together.
Right. It's constantly you're thinking of new resources come available. Some newspaper gets digitized. Someone finds a new picture. Someone finds something in the attic. Found some photos. Someone put up on eBay 3 photos from our lighthouse and spotted them, grabbed that auction real fast. Another person had a photo of one of our lighthouse keepers when he was a young adult, found it at a thrift shop in Georgia, and just was curious about the name on the back, who it was, found that it was one of our lighthouse keepers here, and just kindly stuck it in the mail to us.
Well, that is great. Now to shift gears a little bit, I understand the lighthouse tower is being repainted this year?
That's correct. We have a brick tower. Just a couple of years ago, we did work on the iron lantern, repainting that with several coats of paint. The climate here is really harsh on the iron with being close to the ocean and the humidity and the bright sunshine and everything. The bricks themselves are in fairly good condition, but the paint job is now 9 years old on a 10-year warranty. So we have one of the best kept lighthouses, I think, and we want to keep it that way. Also, the interior, you have more humidity on the interior bricks. You have the tromping of tens of thousands of people every year up and down the stairs, sweaty hands clinging to railings and touching walls. Yeah. So that we try to at least do touch-up work on that on an almost yearly basis. And we figure since we need to do that, we might as well bring in do the exterior work as part of the same project. We'll save on labor costs overall by having it all done at once and keep the lighthouse in good shape. The paint is expensive because it's mineral-based paint. It allows the brick to breathe, which is very important for not trapping not only moisture in there from the climate, but when we have really heavy wind, especially like in a storm, like a hurricane or tropical storm, salt can get pushed into the brick, and that has to be able to breathe that salt back out. We'll actually see it sometimes. A couple of years ago after Hurricane Irma, we didn't get it too bad on this side, but there was enough wind. It was for 2 weeks, part of the lighthouse was just weeping salt back out of the brick. And so if you go down to your local Home Depot and grab some, latex paint there, and slap it on your bricks, it's not going to be a good result.
Josh, I think, everybody, anybody who knows anything about lighthouses, anybody who cares about them at all, certainly would agree that we need to preserve the historic structures themselves. Could you say a little bit about why is it so important that we preserve the history of the lighthouses alongside the actual structures themselves?
I think in general, lighthouses, especially on land, tie very much into the local history. In some cases, it's a part of the maritime industry. For us, we were not the original tourist attraction, the original chamber of commerce to early pioneers and visitors coming down here And they'd stop here and they'd say, okay, where can I hunt? Where should I settle? Give me some advice. Sometimes give me some fresh water. The other part of it is specific to all lighthouses are the keepers themselves. The stories that their lives can intertwine with are very fascinating. And sometimes if they were here for a long period of time, they led a fascinating experience with what they did at the lighthouse, with everything from helping people with shipwrecks and a variety of other, usually good things. Occasionally there's the scandals and the troubles. In some cases, they were here for a short time, but the lighthouse was actually probably the least interesting part of their lives. But that lighthouse serves as this point that draws all these different people together, whether they were pioneers or they went on to become a judge or a prominent local figure. It ties all these different stories together, and it links them in a way that nothing else does. And the lighthouses themselves, once you are in the civil service era, they're all linked together as keepers moved around for promotions and looking for better positions. So there's a lot of interconnectivity, and by preserving that story, you preserve a lot of not just the lighthouse's story, but all these other stories and build a web of history. And people might say, oh, I don't know why the lighthouse is important. But then when it starts tying it all together, if you lose the lighthouse, you lose part of that web of all the history.
Is studying lighthouse history, would you say it's more interesting in some way than studying the history of other types of buildings in general?
I think it has a lot of interesting, like I said at the beginning, because of how much there is to do. Anyone studying lighthouses, especially if they can start tapping into primary resources, there's not a lot of things you can say, I'm doing groundbreaking research on things that nobody has really ever researched before. That's a great feeling. Not just with everything from the lighthouses themselves and exactly what really happened over the course of their history and the keeper stories, even things like the architecture. You can talk to football buffs who will tell you, okay, Vince Lombardi was a coach and he had these assistant coaches that became head coaches, and you have these coaching trees of football strategy that percolates down over the years. But if you look at lighthouses and the architecture, you look at a lighthouse like Cape Hatteras, which then is famous in its own right, but it influenced the design of St. Augustine and Body Island and Currituck, which influenced the design of Ponce Inlet. And you have these little stories of architecture that's another untapped part of history that probably very few people with an architectural mind have looked at to start piecing together. And some of these lighthouse architects, the designer St. Augustine, Paul Pells, was also designing buildings in Washington, worked on one of the buildings for I think it was the Library of Congress. So I think a lot of potential for interesting stories there that are untapped and more, probably, like I said, with the jigsaw puzzle metaphor, there's more out there than we even realized we should be looking for yet.
If there's one thing you could say to our listeners that we haven't already covered, if just one more thing you'd like to add, what would it be?
One thing I would say, and it's not specific to Jupiter, I've been in the lighthouse biz now for about 6 years, and I've been fascinated just how much I've learned in that time period and how much more there is to learn. I've been to about 50 lighthouses, and they've all got unique little stories, and I think that's probably adding even to the question of how lighthouses are different to other buildings. Each lighthouse, is even the ones with the architectural similarities, they have so many individual interesting stories and little individual unique histories that they really benefit visiting each one and kind of learning getting that unique part of lighthouse history that it's certainly not something where I've seen a lighthouse. I've basically seen them all. It's not the case.
Thank you so much, Josh Liller, historian and collections manager for the Loxahatchee River Historical Society and the Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse and Museum. So thanks for spending this time today with me today, Josh. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
It's always a pleasure speaking with Josh, and it was a lot of fun a couple of years ago when he stopped here in Portsmouth, New Hampshire on his way to Maine. I showed him some of our local sites, and he talked about that trip in episode 249 of this podcast. Josh is involved in a free event that's coming up on Thursday, November 20th at 5:30 p.m. at the Town Hall in Jupiter, Florida. It's called Life on Jupiter Waters, and it will be an engaging discussion about life on the water, featuring the people who worked and lived along the Loxahatchee River, the marina, riverboat captains, tales of treasure, and the story of the Jupiter Lighthouse. Josh Liller will provide an historical overview, and he will lead a Q&A with a panel of guests. More details are available on the official website of the town of Jupiter. Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse and Museum has its annual fundraiser, Rendezvous at the Light, coming up on Saturday, November 22nd. Tickets are still available at jupiterlighthouse.org. Josh often gives history presentations at libraries and other venues. Watch for listings if you live in the area. I want to remind our listeners to check out uslhs.org to learn about everything the U.S. Lighthouse Society offers, including preservation grants, tours, and the research catalog. And if you listen to this podcast with Apple Podcasts, please rate and review us. We will be back with a new episode next week, focusing on Dunkirk Lighthouse in New York. Until then, to all our regular listeners and our new ones, thanks so much for listening, and keep a good light.